This is Ben Davidson.
This is Leighton Gray.
This is Tanner Naday.
This is Tom Luongo.
This is Chuck Prodnick.
This is Alex Kreiner.
This is Jim St. Clair. Welcome to the Sean Newman Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast, folks. How's everybody's Monday morning going? On this side, pretty good. We got some big news. We're going to continue to unroll things on the Cornerstone Forum as it slowly goes along here. As we close in on May 10th, we still got plenty of time, but we got another new speaker to announce. We'll get to that in a second. Precious metals can be thought of as the ultimate insurance policy against economic uncertainty and government incompetence. Here in Canada, we got a lot of government incompetence. If you missed the mashup on Friday, you had heard about the other Randy. Yes, the incompetence there just keeps on going. And with deficit spending and fiscal irresponsibility unlikely to end anytime soon, at least here in Canada, now is the time to protect a portion of your hard-earned savings with a form of money that has been recognized for thousands of years. Yes, I'm talking silver and gold. I'm talking silver, gold, bull. They are my go-to for precious metals, whether they're with their complete in-house solutions, whether buying, selling, storing, or adding precious metals to your retirement accounts. They have a new feature exclusively for you that allows you to buy Royal Canadian Mint silver coins for the same price as a generic silver round. All you got to do is text or email Graham down the show notes. Yes, just scroll on down the show notes, folks, and text or email Graham for all the details. CalRock, your trusted partner in surplus oil field equipment, leading supplier of new, used, and reconditioned oil field production equipment here in Canada. But that's not all. Tank fabrication, new and refurbished fluid storage tanks, trucking, pump jacks, and demolition for all your oil field needs. CalRock.ca. The team over at Windsor Plywood, they are the builders of the podcast studio table. They got a giant facelift going on right now. It'll be exciting to see when that's all done. When you're looking for character wood, a piece that's really going to stick out. We're talking mantles, decks, windows, doors, sheds, podcast studio tables. When it comes to looking for character wood, look no further than Windsor Plywood. Tell them I sent you here in Lloydminster. Cornerstone Forum 2025 is heading to Calgary at the Windsport May 10th. You already knew that. We got Tom Luongo, Alex Kreiner, Chuck Prodnick, Kaylin Ford, and joining them, Matt Ehret. By popular demand, I might add. There was several people texting, talking to me about it, and wanting to have Matt Ehret a part of that conversation. And so Matt Ehret is going to be the latest to join in with that group. Just confirmed this week. If you'd been on Substack, you would have saw that last night. And no worries, this year we're going to be over the 6 speakers. We're going to have, this year I got some interesting things cooked up. And so Matt Ehret is just the latest to join an increasing lineup. He's going to be coming in from Eastern Canada. That's going to be a lot of fun. So Tom Luongo, Alex Kreiner, Chuck Prodnick, Kaylin Ford, Matt Ehret, a solid Canadian lineup here. I mean, obviously Tom and Alex coming in from afar. There will be more, believe you me. We got guest hosts Chris Sims of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and Tom Bodrovics from Palisade Gold Radio. Early bird tickets are on right now, and they're going to be on until the end of the year. Somebody was asking me, when are they going off? Well, you're going to get them cheap all the way till January 1. January 1, the ticket prices are going up, so get your tickets right now. We're also going to be here in the next week, maybe 2, adding in where you can buy the table with Tom Luongo, Alex Kreiner, Chuck Prodnick, Kaylin Ford, and Matt Ehret. You get the point, and that's going to be a lot of fun. If you're not signed up for Substack, I don't know what you're doing. Substack is every Sunday night, week in review. That's going to get you at least a snapshot of the past week and give you an idea of what all the guests or podcasts are about. I know that's been helping out a ton of people. It's been, as I said, therapeutic, I think, on this end. It's been a lot of fun to kind of walk back through the episodes, see where we're at. This week is going to be, this week's going to be a little bit crazy, which is a ton of fun for all of you tuning in, I hope. And anyways, Substack, going back to it, free to subscribe to, 1 email a week for the most part. Sunday nights, 5 p.m., we give you the week in review, and we announce new things going on with the Cornerstone Forum, which you just got to hear now. Matt Ehret he's been a longtime podcast guest. He was requested for the first one in April. He is going to make an appearance in May of 2025, so that is the latest to get it added to the itinerary, to the guest list. I don't know, to the lineup. All right, that's what I got for you. The dueling pianos here in Lloydminster, here's an update, is sold out. So that has been, it took a while, some people dragging their feet, but finally it is all locked up. So thank you to all who are going to be in attendance to the dueling pianos. I think it's going to be a fun couple of nights. Looking forward to that. All right, let's get on to that tale of the tape. He's a neurosurgeon, quantum clinician, and author. He's studied light, water, and magnetism in their application to human health. I'm talking about Dr. Jack Kruse. So buckle up. Here we go. Welcome to the Sean Newman Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jack Kruse. So, sir, thanks for hopping on.
No problem, anytime.
Now, as I was telling you before we started, we got a snowstorm happening here, and I'm looking in your backyard going, how's El Salvador?
Well, right now it's nice. I mean, we had a rainstorm last night. I got my guy out here, Will, is cleaning up all the shit that fell off the trees and the bamboo. But this morning it's sunny. You can see the volcanoes all there. Here, there's the Pacific Ocean.
Okay.
It's the temperature right now. I'd say it's probably about 80 Fahrenheit, and the humidity is not terribly bad, probably like maybe 40-50%. It's cool. Not a lot of wind, which is unusual because we usually get wind this time of the year. UV index is supposed to go up to between 11 and 13 today. So my life is substantially better than yours.
Well, I don't know, unless you love the snow, it's yeah.
I grew up in it. You can keep it. The only time I want to see it is for the 2 days around Christmas, and then you can keep it all you want.
Well, I grew up on skates, so some with the snow comes ice, and I enjoy that. Now, how long have you been living in El Salvador?
4 years.
What do you, the first thing I'd really, paid attention to out of El Salvador is when Tucker Carlson had the president on. And obviously he's made headlines in different ways. What over the last 4 years?
Tucker
I mean, obviously.
or Bukele?
Sorry?
Tucker or Bukele?
Tucker
Okay.
Carlson. Yeah.
News. I'm just wondering who you were referencing. I didn't know if you were talking about Bukele or Tucker.
Tucker. Well, I don't know. It seems like El Salvador is going to be a destination of choice here if it already isn't. And I guess a guy sitting there for 4 years, I was just wondering, is that the case?
Oh, I mean, if you understand kind of what has happened here, and you understand, the ethos around decentralization, some of the things that I've done, and I'm assuming that you probably don't know what I've done with the president down here. I actually wrote a constitutional medical freedom amendment for him 18 months ago that is about decentralized medicine. It's actually about getting through a lot of the pitfalls of the modern environment, that fostered some of the bad medicine, some of the chronic disease epidemics, and most recently also covered a lot of the stuff related to the COVID nightmare that everybody went through. And when I first came here, though, the story for me was I've been a Bitcoiner since 2013, and you can tell from the hat. And I had heard rumblings through my network that Bukele was getting very close to making another constitutional amendment to make Bitcoin legal tender with a young buck out of Chicago named Jack Mallers. And I came down here with, I believe it was 6 or 7 of my members, and we did a VIP event here where we stayed right in El Zante, which is known as Bitcoin Beach. And we started to, talk about, economic sovereignty, freedom, what Bitcoin meant. In fact, one of the guys that I hired to be a chef for them that whole 2 weeks, he now works for me full time here. He didn't know anything about Bitcoin. He also came, dressed with the chef hat and the whole thing. And I told him, take all your clothes off, come outside with us, and start learning about decentralized finance and decentralized health. So that's how it started. And literally at the end of the 2 weeks, Bukele announces the law that Bitcoin's legal tender. And ever since that day, this small little country, which is the size of probably the state of South Carolina in the United States, has seen an economic boom. Not only was it good for the economics, but it was great for the people here because about 2 to 3 months after the Bitcoin law goes in, Bukele changes something else. He uses part of their constitution called the exception regime, and he basically puts all the bad hombres in jail, cleans up the country. At that time when I came down here, and most people I don't think know this, but El Zante was a den for the MS-13 gang, even though Bitcoin Beach, was famous before all of this because they were the first, community that was using Bitcoin to transact completely with. Bukele decided to make this, the way the government would do business down here using both American money and Bitcoin. Why? Because they no longer use their own currency because of their civil war that happened in the 80s that the United States, started effectively. And long story short, when he puts the bad guys in jail, the most amazing thing happens is that the extortion that was going on, because this was murder capital of the world, everybody got a raise in their salary of about $300 a month because the bad guys were in jail. So that helped the local inflation rate. People really, it made a huge difference because that was like getting a 30% raise because most people here make about $1,000 every month. And then when the bad guys started getting put in jail, people from Canada, people from the United States, people from Australia said, well, you need to come over and check this out. And the tourism fueled an economic boom. And 4 years ago, people on Wall Street talking about how El Salvador is on life support. They were dead. It's kind of like, patients in the ICU that are getting ready to be intubated in COVID. And the next thing you know, the bonds are being talked about on CNBC, that they're going to go bankrupt. So now we can fast forward to now. Now, El Salvador has over $500 million of Bitcoin on their balance sheet. There's economic boom here is unbelievable. The tourism is off the charts. People are coming here because they want personal sovereignty and personal freedom. People are interested in seeing what else Bukele is going to decentralize now that he's decentralized, finance here. And he's giving freedom back to the people, which is decidedly different than what's happening in the United States and especially in your country, in Canada. And the thing is, when you see a trend that mimics what we saw with George Washington 250 years ago, that kind of gets your attention. It got mine 4 years ago. And yeah, you may say that it may have been dangerous for me to come down at that time, but literally from that 2-week visit, my son was here with me, and so was my nurse that you spoke with. And I said, I think I'm going to buy the place that we had the VIP event in. And I tried to purchase it, but unfortunately, through some nefarious things that happened with some of the people in the Bitcoin community in El Zante, I didn't get that property. But it turned out it was kind of a good mistake because I got this property. And then I also bought a property at the beach. And to say not only was it a good investment, but it was probably the best thing that could have happened for how my life has changed in the last 18 months because I've gotten a lot more politically active. And the interesting thing is I'm an apolitical guy. I could care less about politics prior to, I'd say, the last 18 months. And how did I get drawn into that? Actually, it was my nurse and me sitting down with one of my members, Rick Rubin, to do a podcast to try to teach another guy you may have heard of, Andrew Huberman, some of the things that that he may not have learned at the prestigious Stanford University or the Stanford Research Institute. And obviously that story is deep. Rick knows a lot of different parts of that story, but he didn't even know some of the stuff that I was going to unleash over the last 18 months. And basically what I've been doing for 18 months is telling people what I told Bukele in his basement when he asked me to write the constitutional amendment, how health and wealth are fundamentally linked, how politics has played a role, how the industrial military complex in the United States caused we the people to get sick, and that was globalized through our military, through our policy. How the history books that were written by the victors of World War I and World War II really weren't true, and how it links to probably my mentor in the health space, which is a guy named Robert O. Becker. And Becker was a twice nominated Nobel Prize candidate. He was an orthopedic surgeon who studied limb regeneration and the electronic control system of mammals, amphibians, and that such, and why he got canceled by the industrial military complex in 1977. Turns out many of the stories that link both decentralized health also link to some of the political nightmares that have happened in the United States, starting with probably the Titanic, the USS Liberty, the JFK assassination, 9/11, and COVID. They're all fundamentally linked. And, when you hear a story like I'm laying out for you, you're like, there's no freaking way. There's no way all these things are tied together. But where I got very, very political is when Rick had me back on his podcast to sit down with Bobby Kennedy. At the time, I was doing another member event on Ocean Crossing Cruise, and Rick called me up and said, Bobby Kennedy can talk to you tomorrow. And I was in Paris at the time. I had to get on a plane and fly all the way to Malibu to do that podcast with Bobby. And why was it so important for me to get off a cruise ship when I had paying customers on there and turn it over to my staff for, a 2-week jaunt? Well, it turned out something Bobby needed to know, and something the world needed to know, was uncovered about the COVID operation. And what it was the Qatar event that happened in 1951 through 1957, where SV40 was found in the original polio vaccines. Turned out that a researcher named Kevin McKiernan found the same problem showed up in the Pfizer jabs. So we have an 80-year span where the biggest medical mistake ever made now recapitulates in something that's happening now. So I realized immediately right away that these two stories were linked, that I had to sit down and talk to Bobby. Why? Because it turns out Bobby was involved with that original event, and he didn't know that he was involved. And I explained to him in the Tetragrammaton podcast with Rick Rubin how he was involved in it. And I had to do something with him during that visit to make sure that he knew that I knew something that I could not possibly know unless there was a bigger story that he was interested in. Most of your followers probably know about Bobby's book that he wrote about, Fauci and COVID. That story really went from Fort Detrick all the way to today. It didn't go beyond Fort Detrick. So that podcast that I did with Rick and Bobby goes all the way back to Bernice Eddy, goes all the way back to the David Ferry murder that was tied to his uncle's murder and eventually was tied to his dad's murder. And when Bobby heard that day that SV40 was in COVID, you could see his face almost drop. He's like, how do you know this? And I told him about the story about Kevin McKiernan, that he took 2 expired vials from 2 lots of COVID vaccines and decided to do testing on them. He actually did genetic sequencing. And for those people in your audience who think, that Kevin McKiernan is a fly-by-night guy, he worked with Craig Ventnor on the Human Genome Project. This guy is an absolute rock star in terms of what his field is. But why don't any of you guys know about his skill set is because when he left and got disillusioned with Craig Ventnor as a transhumanist, he decided to take his skill set to the medicinal cannabis space. And he started to sequence genomes for weed all over the world and put those genomes on the internet. And he was actually scrubbed by Big Pharma for doing such. Why? Because Big Pharma doesn't want that information on there. They would rather sell you drugs. So Kevin, of course, has been someone who knows that the system is really a giant club that we're not in, kind of like Carlin told us a long time ago. And Kevin sequenced those 2 vials and found that the SV40 promoter was in it, and that was not disclosed to the FDA. He posted the information very publicly on Twitter, and you can only imagine the opposite side. That's the uniparty side. That means the rhinos and the DNC went absolutely nuts. One of their main protectors is a molecular virologist at the University of South Carolina named Philip Buchholz. Philip Buchholz said, I'm going to end this nonsense once and for all. I'm going to do the same test that Kevin did and prove that he's wrong. So he did, and guess what he wound up doing? He proved Kevin correct. So now we have 2 confirmations of this issue. And then Buchholz, to his credit, did something really impressive. He went to the South Carolina Senate very quickly and told them the truth that, hey, we have a big problem and that these vaccines need to be pulled off the market until we can study this. Why? Because the implications of Kevin's work mean that, and this, just so you and I are clear, this is 2 years ago. Okay, this is not now. We've known about this for a long time. But the aftermarket data shows this very unusual pulse where people are getting cancers, and they're different type of cancers than you'd expect. They're cancers that show up in people who have no risk factors for cancer, and they tend to get stage 3 and stage 4 cancers, meaning these are very virulent cancers. If you know the story of SV40, it makes complete sense why that would happen. And then there's other pulses. One of the big pulses is clotting in the central nervous system. I'm a neurosurgeon, so I know about this because on an average trauma night call, I was effectively retired by COVID because I didn't need to work. But what did I do? I went back into the hospitals in COVID just to do trauma call, to see what was going on in the ICUs, to see what was going on in the centralized system. And what did I find? Every week that I was on, I had averaged 13 blood clots in the brain of different ways. Most of them didn't make any sense. And they were almost always in people who took the jab. The other interesting thing is we started to see a lot of problems with kidney problems, especially the people that had the clots. And then we started to see problems with rhabdomyolysis. Now, the story you were told in the United States and you were told in Canada at that time was it was the fatties that were dying. Well, it turns out now, 4 years later, we know that was bullshit too. It was actually, bullshit propaganda by all of the public health people in all the countries that you know about, because the people who are dying are the people who are fit, the people who lift weights, the people that go to gyms. The people that died in the hospitals were the people that actually got Fauci's drugs, the recommended drugs, and not the drugs that they should have gotten. And those were the people that were also intubated in ICUs. So in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024, I was in those emergency rooms. I was in those ICUs, and I was seeing people drop and how they dropped. And I kept looking at the data, and I knew that the data that was coming from the government didn't match what I was seeing in hospitals. And when everything clicked for me was when Kevin did his study 2 years ago and found what he found. And I said, now I have an explanation to meet the observations that I was making, in the hospital. And I was very quiet about what I was seeing because of the situation that I've, released on a lot of other podcasts now, because you're a little bit late to Jack Kruse's game. But I told people that there's a big story here that starts with Becker, that ties to this polio story, that ties to the industrial military complex, that this is a bioweapons program that started in the 1950s. And the only way to explain how SV40 could show up in the first round of the polio stuff with the Salk vaccine and in Fauci's vaccines, here in 2020, there's no explanation at all that makes any scientific sense. And I explained when I spoke to Kevin McKiernan that the reason that McKiernan and Buchholz didn't know about this is because all the things that were done in the first bioweapons program that occurred on Magazine Street in New Orleans with Salk vaccine was all done covertly by the industrial military complex to try to fix the problem. They tried for a long time, almost 8 or 9 years, to remove SV40 from the Salk vaccines, and they found out that they couldn't do it, and then they found out something really interesting. The modus operandi they used to remove it was the same idea that cancer doctors have with cancer patients, to use radiation. And it turns out when you radiate SV40, it gets more virulent. It makes cancers that actually become deadly literally in a couple of rounds of radiation. And just like the U.S. government always does, there's a utopian way to do things and then a dystopian way to do it. There's this process, the doctor they put in charge of all this was a guy named Dr. Alton Ochsner. And Ochsner hired the two best experts, one in viral etiologies to cancer. Her name was Dr. Mary Stewart. And her classmate was Dr. Mary Sherman, who was the expert in bone cancer in the world. And these people both trained at the University of Chicago, where the Fermi National Institute is, and they were experts in radiation. And then magically, in the place that I did my residency, which is where all this went down, a LINAC, a linear accelerator, shows up to the U.S. Public Health Hospital. And what they do, they tried to take Salk's vaccine, put it into nocturnal mammals, mice and rats, to try to eradicate it. Instead, they realized they made an incredible bioweapon. The project is close to the end in 59. So what happens? There's a Cuban crisis. Castro takes over, and the military decides, well, if we can make this really nasty virus, we can put it in tobacco, and maybe we can get into a cigar and give it to Castro and kill him and take him out. Why? Because if you remember anything about your history at the time, Senator Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin was on an anti-communist kick. And that was going through all through the 50s. Who was the people that work with Joe McCarthy initially? Most people have forgotten their history, but it turns out it was Roy Cohn, a lawyer who had dual passport status with Israel and the United States, and then a guy you may have heard of, Robert Kennedy Sr. That's Robert Kennedy Jr.'s dad. He was working with McCarthy and with Roy Cohn at this time. And it turns out that McCarthy, Ochsner, most of the oil families, specifically Clint Murchison, who owned the Dallas Cowboys at the time, H.L. Hunt, who owned the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Bush family, which I think you know about their links to both Halliburton, Dick Cheney, and all those. They formed this unholy alliance with these anti-communist people, and the government came up with the idea to try to take out Castro. Who was germane in that? Well, this is where the story gets really crazy, because a lot of people don't know about this history because it's not been put in history books. The bioweapons lab that was covert was headed by Ochsner. You had the other two doctors I mentioned, but who was the key principals of the lab? The key principals of the lab were David Ferry, who was a disgraced airline pilot from Eastern Airlines that used to run CIA missions back and forth between Cuba. This is even before the Bay of Pigs. And he happened to train a guy that you may have heard of, Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was part of this bioweapons lab, and at the time, he was a member of the CIA. In fact, he was going to be the person to deliver the SV40 cigar to Castro, which explains the reason why he was sent to Russia by the CIA to try to fool Castro, to let him in closer to him, because as most of you know, Castro is a communist and so are Russians. Therefore, the CIA was going to use a spy to deliver the bioweapon. And he was really big into helping create the bioweapon. And then they had this young little 18-year-old who was basically the lab technician who was promised by Oshner that if she went along with everything that they were doing, that she would be given a spot at Tulane Medical School so she could become a doctor. Her name was Judith Ferry Baker. How do we know most of the history that I'm telling you is because she documented it in an autobiography about this time in her life. She's the only person still alive today who knows about all these different pieces and parts. I'm probably the second person. Why? Because obviously I was not present in any of those times, but all of these things went down in the place where I did my neurosurgery residency. And it turns out when I got to Oshner as a neurosurgery resident, I asked one simple question. How in the hell do we have $100 million LINAC in a small community hospital in New Orleans? I mean, it just didn't make sense to me. And at the time, Oshner has become a behemoth medical center now. But back in this time, late 80s, early 90s, it wasn't. It was just a regular community hospital in New Orleans. So I started to ask questions, and let's just put it this way. The questions got stimulated because during my first year of my residency, a famous movie producer named Oliver Stone was making a movie you may have heard about called JFK. And then it got even crazier that one of my ER nurses, her name was Virginia Garrison. She was a ER nurse at Charity Hospital. Her dad was Jim Garrison, the prosecutor of Clay Shaw in the JFK trial. And she was the person that actually told me, Jack, you're getting ready to go to spend 2 years at Oshner in your neurosurgery residency. You may want to be really careful with the people that you're going to be dealing with over there. And, she filled me in on a lot of the different things that, you probably have heard me talk about now for the last 18 months. And when I get to Oshner, of course, me being a New Yorker, and I'm very curious, I decide to go straight to the source. I go to Dr. Oshner's son. His name is John Oshner. He was a very famous cardiovascular surgeon who trained under DeBakey, who started all the heart programs in Texas. And this all started with Tulane Medical School with a guy named Rudolph Matas. Oshner took over for Matas. And it turns out all these doctors that were at Tulane all were FBI informants, and they were all CIA informants in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And since you're a Canadian, I don't expect you to know a lot of the history of Louisiana, but Louisiana has had a lot of crooked politicians in it, starting with a guy named UEP Long, who used to be the governor. He was probably the most famous politician, but his son became a senator in the United States. And we have another guy in the House of Representatives named Hale Boggs, where a lot of the federal buildings in New Orleans to this day are named after him. It turns out the reason why these guys are important is these are the two guys that controlled the military budget and the CIA budget at the time. So I finally figured out from John Oshner that Hale Boggs gave his father a Hill Burton grant in the 1950s to get this LINAC, and the LINAC was installed at the U.S. Public Health Hospital. That's not where it was when I was in my residency, but the U.S. Public Health Hospital was located across the street from Children's Hospital, where I did my pediatric neurosurgery rotations. So when I was a resident, I used to see these buildings across the street, and there was one big building that had this, 15-foot wall. It looked like, they were trying to keep people out. And I always asked questions when I was there. And when I found out that the LINAC in the basement of Oshner came from that building, I couldn't get any answers from any of the people that I was doing my residency with. So what did I do? I was a little bit wiser than most people. I went to talk to the janitors of the building. Those are the guys that clean up. And I asked questions about what was going on. He says, yeah, that building is not 3 stories above. It goes 3 stories under the ground. I said, really? And the building at the time I did my residency was decommissioned. You couldn't get into it. Okay. They wouldn't let us into it. And, but the janitor, I used to talk to all the time because he cleaned the neurosurgery clinics. He also cleaned, a lot of the places that I had done my rotation around. And I was very interested in because of what I had learned from John Oshner. And John Oshner is the one that told me that his father injected 2 of his grandchildren in front of the medical staff with the Salk vaccine. This occurred in 1951, and the boy died of polio 7 days later. The granddaughter got polio as well, but she didn't die. She just got it in one of her extremities. And this story was very, very famous in Oshner circles. This was one of the stories that Virginia Garrison had told me about. And when I talked to John Oshner about it, I wanted confirmation from him. He gave me the confirmation. And then he told me, by the way, if you want to find out a lot about this information, you can go down to our medical school library, which was in Oshner, and pull up the microfiche. And when I was down there, then I heard something else from the librarian that really stunned me. She goes, yeah, if you want to find out more about this, if you go to Tulane Neurology and Tulane Neurosurgery in the basement of Charity Hospital, which is where I did my residency, she goes, there's a lot more information about this whole story. So I, of course, on my time off, go to the basement there, and there was amazing archives. For those of you who don't know, Charity Hospital was the oldest hospital in North America, opened in 1753. It was operational all the way to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. It probably had the best medical records of any hospital in the United States. The problem is they weren't very well organized. Why? Because this was a public free hospital. We called it charity because anybody who went there got free care. And when I went down to the basement, the ladies who already knew me from the medical charts, I asked them where I could find some of this information. They directed me to this big dark room, and I started going through boxes of things, and that's where I found a lot of papers that linked to MK Ultra. And I was stunned by that because I knew a little bit about MK Ultra because of the Church Commission when I was growing up as a young boy. And that's where we found out that Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather were CIA operatives. And I knew that this was really important because Dan Rather was one of the beat reporters that was in Dallas the day that JFK got shot. And it turned out that Dan Rather lied to the American public when he talked about how Zapruder's, or I should say the head of JFK, moved when he was shot. Turned out what he said on TV was exactly opposite of what the autopsy showed, and also exactly opposite of what was on the Zapruder film. So I started to get really interested, and when I kept going down there for 2 or 3, 4 weeks, the ladies in Charity Hospital directed me then to Tulane Neurology and Tulane Neurosurgery. So I go to Tulane Neurology and Neurosurgery, and there I find the mother lode of a lot of the stuff that was linked to MK Ultra. And the reason why this is a big deal for you to hear, you may not know that the director of the CIA named Richard Helms destroyed all of the MK Ultra files in Washington, D.C. in 1973. Why? Because he knew that Senator Church, who was from Kentucky, was going to open this commission called the Church Commission. Church Commission is where we found out some of the nefarious things that were done around JFK, some of the nefarious things that were done around MK Ultra. But the big one that the United States population found out is that there was 400 people in media that were bought and paid for by the CIA, basically to run a giant psyops on the American people to make sure that the truth never came out. So here I am now, 89.
What year is that?
80, 88, 89, 90, and 91.
So we know 30 plus years ago, 400 plus media people in the United States, let alone anywhere else, were already bought and paid for.
Well, no, actually, we knew that in 1976 and 77 because that's when the Church Commission happened in the United States.
Yes. Okay, so go even further back then.
Yeah, it goes further back. And then here's the crazy part. The United States Congress, upon hearing all this, realized that they have to open up another inquiry into the JFK assassinations because of these links made. And unfortunately, I would like to tell you that they were good things to look back into the tragedy, but it wasn't. Why? Because these things have been hidden in the JFK archives to this very day. In fact, the last time Trump was a president, he said he was going to release them.
And he did.
But when he didn't, when he read them and found out what the links were, this kind of stunned him. And I think I know the reason why, because the links are tied to another giant psyops, kind of like I told you before, that the Titanic and JFK were probably two psyops related to the same problem, which was the bankers in the United States and the Federal Reserve. This was really a story about money, and it turns out the bankers are the ones that funded the industrial military complex. And those guys specifically, when I use the term intelligence, I'm talking about FBI, CIA, and the Mossad, okay? MI6 for the UK is a little bit different. But those three people are synonymous in the United States. And the reason why is people need to remember how Israel becomes a country, where it starts. It starts on November 2nd, 1917, with something called the Balfour Declaration, written by King George and the Rothschilds. And basically, in World War II, because remember, this is in the middle of World War II, right at the end, Palestine was a property of imperialism of the Ottoman Empire. The Brits defeat the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, in World War I, and they get Israel. Then it's not called Israel, it's called Palestine. And the Rothschild bankers at the time in Europe decide that they would like to make a homeland for the Jews. So they convinced King George that this would be a really good idea to basically repopulate Palestine with the Jews, so that way they have their own homeland. And at the time, 97% of the people in 1917 are Christian or Muslim, only 3% are Jewish. Turns out a lot of the Jews don't really want to live in the desert. That's really what's not in your history books. So it turns out the Rothschilds and King George come up with a plan after World War II, and that plan is called the Transfer Agreement. When Hitler takes power, and he was propped up, just so everyone's clear, by the royal family and by the Rothschilds, he was not brought to power on his own devices. He was propped up by those people, because what effectively did Britain want? They wanted to reclaim their alloidial title back to both Russia and the United States. So the Treaty of Versailles was written to make sure another war would happen. But the interesting part starts, because most of you know that the United States doesn't get involved in the war until 1941. But in 1933, this transfer agreement is made between the popes and the royal family to repopulate Palestine. And basically, Hitler was told to take all the Jews in Germany, take all their wealth, and then resettle them in Palestine. That was the original agreement. And most people don't have any clue that this history is out there and it's discoverable. It's called the Havara Agreement. There's books written actually by Jewish people about this. And if you understand anything about this story, basically, here you have Jewish people selling out Jewish people. That's what it looks like. And it turns out this is why there's a classification I think in modern politics between Jews and Zionists. They're not the same. The Zionists are the people that wanted to create the Jewish state. Predominantly, that's the Rockefeller family in the United States, the Rothschilds in the UK, and the British royal family. The fourth silent partner in all this is the Roman Catholic Church, specifically the papacy. Why is the papacy involved in this? Because they were promised in this transfer agreement that they would get control of Jerusalem. Not the rest of the country, but they would be able to maintain control of that. And it turned out the papacy and the royal family are both banked by the Rothschild and Rothschild family. That was the main link. The story gets really crazy after the war in 1945. the guy that ran the Manhattan Project is a guy named General Groves. General Groves is kind of lost to history for most people, but he ran the biggest industrial project ever in United States history, where he took a guy that was a member of the Council of Foreign Relations that you may have heard of named Allen Dulles. He sent Allen Dulles into Europe to poach all the Jewish physicists to create the atomic bomb in the Manhattan Project. And he basically repopulated them all in the desert. Why did he repopulate them in the desert? Well, it turned out the Germans wanted to know why the Americans were taking all these Jewish scientists from Europe and bringing them to the States. So they were sending U-boats over to New York Harbor and letting spies come out. And if you know anything about the history of the war at this time, the United States Pacific Fleet is decimated at Pearl Harbor. They barely made it out of Midway in the Pacific, and everybody else was in Europe fighting, the main front of the Germans. So there was nobody left really to patrol home. So Groves comes up with the idea, why don't we talk to the people that patrol the docks in the Brooklyn Navy yards where these people are believed to come on? And he tells FDR, go talk to Meyer Lansky. Now, Meyer Lansky is a famous Jewish mobster who came over in the 1911s, 1920s. Very good friends with the Bronfman family, of the liquor people. And you should know that because they live up in Canada. That's where their empire really is. And FDR says to Meyer Lansky, we'd like you to patrol the docks with the Italian mob because we know that you guys control that. And what we're specifically interested in is finding any of these German spies. So Lansky famously says to FDR, yeah, we'd be more than happy to help you, but you're going to have to let my partner in crime go from a maximum security prison to a minimum security prison. So, in fact, General Groves and FDR actually do that. And they make this deal with the devil, but guess what? The deal pays off for the United States government almost immediately. Lansky finds 19 spies in the Brooklyn Navy Yards. 18 of them are slaughtered, but there's one guy that's not. And that one guy is named Dr. Kurt Plotner. Kurt Plotner is who I talked about in the Danny Jones podcast. He is where MK Ultra begins, okay? I found out all of this in the basement of Charity Hospital, where the original paperwork was still remaining. It wasn't destroyed like it was in D.C. And the interesting part of Plotner's story, he tells Lansky what he finds, and then Lansky immediately turns this over to the Americans, but then he also turns it over to the Israeli, and remember, they're not Israel yet, but it's the Jewish state intelligence community that's coming together that's actually working with the United States government to build this bomb in Los Alamos. And Lansky tells both of them the same information. This information goes back to the United States, and what do they start to do? They start to look into some of the things that Plotkin told them. And the three key things that Plotkin told them is that Hitler was using chemicals from A.G. Farben to make the Jews more docile so that they were easy to control in the concentration camps, and also to do experiments on them. The interesting thing that I read, there was no evidence that I saw that this was being used to put them to death. This was more to make them more docile to do a transfer, later on. And there wasn't a lot of war stuff there, but it was a very interesting discussion. And what they talked about were three main chemicals: fluoride, Mexican peyote, and LSD. Those were three of the things that MK Ultra actually studied. And what happened there? Allen Dulles, through another project called Operation Paperclip. Most people who know the history of the CIA know that Paperclip, and they believe that Paperclip began after the war. It turns out it wasn't true. How we got all the Jewish scientists to go to Los Alamos was actually the original Operation Paperclip story. And it continued on after the war, because that's when we brought 200,000 German Nazi folks to the United States. Most people know about Werner von Braun with the rocket and all that stuff that eventually today becomes, SpaceX and NASA. But people don't realize the other thing about these 200,000 people they bring in, they immediately get populated in all these colleges all over the United States. You know, Hopkins, Stanford, University of Chicago, Harvard University, Yale. And what eventually happens as this program develops, because we're in the 40s now, eventually General Groves leaves the military because he's forced out by Eisenhower. And a lot of it has to do with the 2 bombs that were dropped that didn't need to be dropped. Eisenhower was vehement after FDR died that Groves was a problem. He got rid of him. And what did Groves do? He forms an unholy alliance with Meyer Lansky, Murder Inc., and the industrial players that are present in Texas and California to create the industrial military complex outside the United States military. And he starts that with 2 companies. One is called Remington Rand, who was the #1 arms producer for World War II. And the other company eventually is named Burroughs. And Burroughs is an electronics outfit that makes machines. Didn't make much sense to a lot of people, but Groves is operating here from 47 through about 61 outside. Lansky sets Groves up, and eventually he meets Howard Hughes. And then the rest is history. That's when you get Grumman. That's when you get Raytheon. That's when you get all the big players. What happens with Groves' original plan? The original plan is Burroughs joins with Remington Rand and becomes a company you may have heard of, Sperry. It's the first computer company ever in the United States. Sperry next changes its name to Unisys. What does Unisys do? It actually creates 46 supercomputers that are eventually sold back to the United States military. Well, in 1958, General Eisenhower realizes he made probably the biggest mistake of his life by putting Groves outside the military so he couldn't watch him. And what changes his tune? In 1957, Sputnik gets released by the Russians up into space, and immediately Eisenhower brings Groves flunkies back in. In 1958, those flunkies are called DARPA. Okay? So DARPA comes back into the United States. It's basically the same setup as the Manhattan Project, where you have scientists that are placed in silos. In the Manhattan Project, the silos are only 10 deep. In DARPA, it's now 120 different areas. And the scientists are isolated so that you never know what anybody else is doing. Why is that important for you to understand? Well, again, it goes back to that story I told you about utopia and dystopia. And it started with Groves. Groves realized through his work with a guy named Rabi, R-A-B-I, and Glenn Seaborg, who wins the Nobel Prize for discovering plutonium, that we can make the most energy-dense nuclear reaction if we use thorium. And General Groves makes the decision that we should not go that route. Why? Because when you use thorium nuclear reactor, it makes no plutonium, so you can't make nuclear weapons. So instead, we make the decision very early on in the bomb creation that we're going to use fissionable uranium-233 and uranium-235. Why? Because you make small amounts of plutonium to create nuclear weapons. Not only can you use it for electricity production in a nuclear power plant, but you can also make things that the military need. That is the key decision that actually changes really the rest of the world. If we had went the thorium route, many of the things that are happening today in current events probably never happen. But this is the utopian and dystopian choice that people made. It's the same choice that happened with SV40. And you'll see certain things are good, but there's other things that are bad. And the industrial military complex is always looking for their own angle. And once that decision's made, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is made, the Atomic Commission is made. These commissions are all stacked with these 200,000 people that they brought over from Germany who were Jewish, and they were all in all the physics departments, all in these universities I told you about. This didn't extend just to physics. These people were involved in biotechnology. They were involved in big pharma. They were involved in drug development. And the biggest area they were involved with is actually technology. And this is where General Groves basically creates Silicon Valley. And then you have a retooling in the 50s and 60s when the transistor is found and we learn about semiconduction. This is where Becker comes into the story. Becker starts to do his work on limb regeneration in the 1950s through the 60s, and he finds out there's a DC electric system that controls mammalian regeneration. The government, specifically DARPA, gets very interested in this through the U.S. Navy, and they hire Becker to start doing a whole bunch of different experiments. And this is merged with their knowledge that they get from MK Ultra. They put one of these doctors who they brought in Operation Paperclip over, that's Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb morphs the program from drugs to wired technology to wireless technology, because what's developing at the same time is the story I just told you with Groves and semiconductors, silicon semiconductors. It's happening all at the same time. And the computer becomes a big deal because we're trying to catch up in the space mission because the Russians beat us there first. Because what did the Russians do? They focused more on the technology than we did. Most of that stuff that was being done outside the military would have been stuff that led us to space. But Eisenhower was much more interested in conventional kinetic warfare. And that's the reason why Groves was looked at as superfluous. So the convergence of events happens during the Cuban Revolution. And then we get the Cuban Missile Crisis, where, again, it's Russia and the United States. Kennedy's now the president. And the industrial military complex, which is now brought back into the country in about 4 years with DARPA, the military brass, specifically the Joint Chiefs of Staff, believe that Kennedy made a catastrophic mistake by not giving them air cover for the Bay of Pigs. And immediately he goes from being somebody who they trusted to somebody who they didn't. And this is what I like to remind people, that if you listen to Eisenhower's farewell speech, which is delivered in January of 1961, he tells the American population something that seemingly comes out of the blue. But now that I'm discussing this with you, maybe you'll realize that it really wasn't out of the blue. He tells people that the industrial military complex is the biggest risk to the American population. Why? Because from 1958 to 1961, he saw exactly what they were capable of doing. And it turned out this is the group of people that are now in Washington, D.C., who make a decision to assassinate a duly elected president because they didn't like what he did. And ultimately, the choice from 1959 through 1963 is, do we take out Castro or do we take out Kennedy first? And it turns out Kennedy does a couple of things that actually cast the die to him. And when I did the Danny Jones podcast, this is where it got murky for a lot of people, because he didn't want to go down this trap door, because it's a trap door that, I have to tell you, explains a lot of the things that are going on in politics now. Like, if you say anything against the Mossad, the state of Israel, you get branded as an anti-Semite. But I look at it a little bit differently. When another country affects our policy, it should be fair game that we criticize them, okay? It doesn't mean we're anti-Semites. It means that we have a duty to, we the people in the United States, and actually the rest of the world, to let people know what is going on. And the reason why this nuclear story is a big deal, when Eisenhower is the president and JFK is in the Senate at the time, he's a senator from Boston, there is a big belief between Eisenhower and Kennedy. Remember, they're in two different parties. Eisenhower's a Republican and Kennedy's a Democrat, about non-nuclear proliferation. In other words, Eisenhower and Kennedy do not want nuclear weapons going anywhere else. Who is the group of people that are jonesing for nuclear weapons all through the 50s and into the 60s? Israel. David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli prime minister. He wants nuclear weapons, and he wants them in a bad way. Why? Because he's got a desert country that's surrounded by Arabs, meaning they're arch enemies. And he knows that he needs to have the best weaponry in the world so that he can make sure that the Mossad and the Israeli Defense Forces are armed to the teeth so they can fend off any of the problems they have. Now, remember where we are now. This is 59 to 61. This is before the 7-day war. What do we know about Ben-Gurion's actions in 1947 and 48? If you think the genocide in Gaza started this, in 2024 with this bullshit in October, you'd be wrong. Ben-Gurion started it in 1947. That was the first, how shall we say, ethnic cleansing. It became state policy of Israel to go even further than the Balfour Declaration went. The Balfour Declaration was written so Christians, Muslims, and Jews could all live in harmony in Palestine. Well, that changed when Israel formed. And the Zionists, that's the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and every Israeli prime minister since David Ben-Gurion has a different idea. They want Israel to be only Jew, and that's it, nothing else. And that's where the first cleansing begins in 47. So from 47 to 62, you have David Ben-Gurion meeting with Eisenhower and JFK, vehemently making the case that Israel needs a nuclear weapons program. So what does Eisenhower and JFK find out at this time frame while all this other shit's going on? They find out about this nuclear reactor called Dimona. And Dimona is where the French are helping the Israelis build a nuclear power plant so that they can make electricity, okay? But it turns out they don't make the decision to go the thorium way. They make the same decision the United States military does and goes, we are going to use uranium-233 and 235. Then something really crazy happens at the end of Eisenhower's presidency. It turns out that David Ben-Gurion secured deuterium-laden water, which is heavy water, which you would need for a high-pressure nuclear reactor. And he reiterates to Eisenhower again, and eventually to Kennedy in 60, 61, and 62, that they're only interested in making electricity. Well, Kennedy, when he becomes president, mandates to Ben-Gurion that we need to go in and send our weapons inspector in and make sure that you are not enriching uranium to get plutonium to make a nuclear weapon. Okay? That becomes the single biggest reason why Kennedy is killed. Okay? Because Ben-Gurion fights against him tremendously, and then magically, when a letter is sent from Kennedy to Ben-Gurion, that letter never gets read by Ben-Gurion because Ben-Gurion gets up and quits. Someone else comes in, and Ben-Gurion then starts to work with the people in the Jewish mafia, the people in the Italian mafia, and the people in the CIA and FBI who General Kruse creates. 1947, when General Kruse is forced out, he actually hand selects the group of people that will make the CIA. It's buried in one of Truman's first bills that are out, called the National Security Act of 47. It doesn't become operational until 48 because General Kruse made a clerical error on purpose. So the CIA technically doesn't form till 48. Why does he do that? He needs about a year and a half to get all his financing in order from Meyer Lansky and from Howard Hughes and all that to get the companies up and running that eventually will form our industrial military complex. He's very successful. Look, he already built a bomb. He already showed you he's got the chops to do some really big things. Well, trust me, this guy was a machine. And this is where Kruse industrial military players and the Israelis start to work in unison. And the interesting issue for the JFK event, everybody tried to figure out that looks around the JFK event, why was the CIA unsuccessful 7 or 8 times taking Kennedy out? Well, it turns out one of the guys that was involved in this, which is Santo Trafficante, became friends with Castro, and they found out after the casino business went boom in 59 in Cuba that drugs were a way better way to launder money because the money was much greater. So Trafficante forms a deal with Castro, and who knows about this because Santo Trafficante works with Meyer Lansky. So what do they default to? They default to laundering drugs, and Meyer Lansky is not about killing Kennedy. He was not interested in this at all. He thought it was bad for business, but he's still the bank account for Murder Inc. and also for General Groves and a lot of the industrial military players. When the Bay of Pigs happens, eventually the die is cast. Then the issue happens with Kennedy not selling the Israelis any type of nuclear fuel. And you know what the history is of 1963. What happens immediately after that? LBJ comes in. The executive order ending the Vietnam War is turned back on. LBJ sends the industrial military guys to do Vietnam. The other thing that's changed is magically some plutonium goes missing, about 90 kilograms, in a place called Numek in Pennsylvania. And the Israelis get nuclear weapons. And nobody says anything about this in 1965, including LBJ. Then something crazy happens that is actually the precursor for 9/11. 1967, USS Liberty, brand new spy boat that the United States puts right next to Israel and Egypt in 1967 to monitor the 7-day war. Remember I told you the story about Ben Gurion in 47 with the Gaza? Well, the 7-day war is the second part of this play. They go in, and this ship, the USS Liberty, has unbelievable capabilities because it can connect with satellites, and they're collecting all the data real time of the Israelis doing ethnic cleansing. Guess what happens in 1967 that the United States government, Israel, didn't anticipate? Remember I told you the Russians beat us to space first? They intercept all the intelligence that's on the USS Liberty. So what magically happens in 1967? Israeli fighter pilots are given the clearance to destroy the USS Liberty in the Mediterranean. It's taken out. Thousands of soldiers are killed on this boat, American soldiers. To this day, 6 decades later, that has never been explained by the USS military. In fact, LBJ cancels the inquiry into it and accepts Israel's excuse that it was mistaken identity. The eyewitnesses at that time know that this story is full of shit. But the reason why is because this is the second time now the Israelis have gone in, and the Americans allowed them to shoot their own boat down to the ground and kill Americans. So this is the first time the industrial military complex, first they kill a president, then they kill American soldiers because they use them as human shields to protect their partners. That's exactly what happens in 9/11. That is the reason why when Jeffrey Epstein is arrested much later, in his mantle above his living room is a picture of Bill Clinton in Monica Lewinsky's dress wearing red shoes. The red shoes link to papacy. The blue dress is the Democrats and Monica Lewinsky that were behind this, but Bill Clinton's in it because he was captured by the Israeli intelligence agencies, the CIA and the FBI. Guess what's in the bedroom? The bedroom has a picture of George Bush, red background, throwing planes into a building. This is in Epstein's bedroom. That is the story, real story of 9/11. It is basically another tale that the U.S. Liberty is. The 3,000 people, 3,000 plus people that were killed on 9/11 were killed for two main reasons. They were killed so that we could get the Patriot Act in the United States to set up the surveillance state. This is where we get to Google and their story and all the new industrial military players. But what's the other thing? They needed another way to launder money. They had to create more money. The Iran-Contra affair in the mid-'80s with Oliver North, Poindexter, and all that, basically at global scale created the drug war. The United States made tons of money doing that to fund covert operations. But that morphs into 9/11 because what do? They use put options on United Airlines and 30 other countries. They make huge amounts of money. This is done through a place called Alex Brown Associates, which is eventually bought by Deutsche Bank. That also is put to the shelf. There's massive amounts of money made. And, all these stories are out. But the problem is nobody's linking all these stories together. And it sounds kind of hard for you to realize that this story is built in and around the industrial military complex. But basically, these people that are running this shadow government, very similar to what I told you about Bukele's El Salvador, that was the gangs. Once you eliminate the gangs, El Salvador becomes a paradise. What the next president of the United States needs to do is it needs to eliminate our shadow government, which is the industrial military complex. Here's the problem. Both presidents, whether it be Harris or Trump, are linked in big ways to this industrial military complex. So you may be able to take out pieces and parts, but one of the biggest industrial military players right now that I'm concerned with is Peter Thiel, who's a Trump supporter, but he basically created J.D. Vance as a senator, and now J.D. Vance is the vice president. Why can I give some plausible deniability to Trump? J.D. Vance is the perfect person to pick as a vice president. Why? Because remember, the industrial military complex tried to assassinate Trump twice. Okay? No question about that they tried to do that. So Trump picks J.D. Vance. Why? Because he's more unsavory to the people that tried to assassinate him than not. Because if you kill Trump, you get stuck with J.D. Vance, which may cause a lot of different problems for a lot of the different players that are involved here. So for Trump's survivability, it was brilliant. Most people don't know he actually tried to pick RFK to be the vice president twice, and he was rebuffed twice. Why? Because I think Bobby Kennedy knows that he's also on the kill list. Okay? And we talked about that at my podcast that I did with Rick Rubin and Bobby on Tetragrammaton. So when you come up to speed now, you realize we have a vice presidential candidate that has questionable background. We have Peter Thiel and Sergey Brin backing him. We have Rocket Man that is doing lots of good things. I mean, he's protected the First Amendment. In my opinion, he got Trump elected. But I look at Elon Musk like I look at the story of COVID and SV40 and also the bomb decision between thorium and fissionable uranium, because I think I know what Elon Musk's Neuralink and his rockets are going to be used for. Surveillance above. And what are the industrial military players on the ground that are in Silicon Valley looking to do? Use the bioweapons that they're perfecting in COVID to basically use nanobot technology to put into those down the road so that they can put the chips in us so that we absorb and emit so we can be controlled above. And, here's the part of the story I haven't told anybody, my friend. Why do I think I'm right about this? I'm not giving you anything I don't have receipts for. You may remember a guy named Charles Lieber, who was at Harvard University, who was arrested about 5 or 6 years ago. And he is the United States expert in nanobot technology. He's based at Harvard. The United States Department of Justice arrested this guy. Do you know why? He was selling a lot of his information to the Chinese. Guess why? Where was COVID built? In the Wuhan lab. A lot of this information that Lieber had about nanobot technology was going to be used in the coronavirus program that was started by Fauci and Daszak from North Carolina. So guess what? The COVID jabs that were released are not the, how shall we say, the full Monty. Why? Because they decided to unleash the COVID thing to neutralize Trump the first go around. Because Trump, while he does have big time links to a lot of the Israeli connections, he's still a loose cannon for them. He's a loose cannon for them because the last part of their program right here, they don't want the really Bitcoin. They'd rather have a CBDC. Why? Because they need money that they can rehypothecate so they can run their forever wars. Remember, that's a story that I've told you over and over and over again that started with General Groves. You have to have cheap money that you can corrupt in order to run these programs that the Mossad does, the CIA does, the FBI. But I don't want you to think that the military is not involved in this. The military in the United States is extremely corrupt, especially the upper echelons. Why? Because they believe that they really run the country. And I have to be honest with you, in my opinion, they kind of do. Because it doesn't matter who you vote for, because we have a uniparty in the United States. You know, they're both the same. The only difference is the shit sandwich that you get from each side, because both of them have warts. The key is we just voted on November 5th for the one with the less warts, because Kamala is probably more like the people in China and North Korea. Trump is more like the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, but I don't think Trump realizes how nefarious some of these people are. He does know that his best friend, his former best friend that was taken out, JFK Jr., that's the reason why Trump didn't release any of the information in around JFK. Now, he says this time he's going to do it. That's great rhetoric, but I need to see the action. And, you know, ideation without execution leads to deletion of every good idea. He gave us plausible deniability in Trump 1.0. In my opinion, day one, what Trump needs to do is he needs to free Russ Ulbricht. He needs to free all the J6 guys that were put in jail for no fucking reason. And then he also needs to release the JFK tapes so that we learn once and for all that this was doing. I think the United States is filled with a bunch of people that can handle that our own government was tied to this. Because what we need to do, I don't believe the United States gets better until we're told the truth about that event. Why? Because it turns out every executive since that time has been corrupt. We know that since the Warren Commission, the entire Congress is corrupt, with the exception of one guy, probably two guys, both from the same state. And ironically, this links back to the Church Commission, Kentucky. We have Rand Paul, a senator, and we have Thomas Massie, a Republican. Both of these guys are not really big fans of AIPAC, which is another thing that I didn't tell you about the JFK story. JFK wanted to make AIPAC register as a foreign agent. And that was another spur in the ass of David Ben-Gurion that he didn't like. So that tells you that anybody who goes against the intelligence or military basically gets taken care of with acute lead toxicity. And you just saw that Trump got shot at twice. So while many people may listen to the story that I'm unleashing to you here, may think, well, Trump is more the same. No, I actually think there's some redeeming qualities to Trump. I truly do believe that. I do believe he knows now the ties of the people that got him to New York real estate, the people that got him into politics, the people who he's been friends with his whole life. I think he knows that they have a nefarious side. The one thing I do think that Trump has deep, he's a patriot. He really cares about the United States. But I'm very concerned about the money side of things with Trump. That I will tell you. I do not like Susie Wiles as a pick. I also do not like Howard Nalutnik, because his story goes back to the story I told you about 9/11. He magically took his son to school on 9/11 while the rest of the people in Cantor Fitzgerald got killed. Okay? I've always been interested to know what his activities, financial activities, were around that event. I've never trusted him or Silverstein. Silverstein was also a guy that put a lease on the World Trade Centers about 3 or 4 months before they went down. And he was paid off huge for the buildings being destroyed. And it turns out the person that helped him get his payoff, another guy tied to the same story in New York, Elliot Spitzer. And you know, Elliot Spitzer used to run the Southern District. That's the same district where Epstein is killed. It's the same district where Ghislaine Maxwell is right now. So you need to realize that the Southern District of New York, the state of New York, probably the most corrupt part of the United States. Second most corrupt part is Silicon Valley, because these two people are linked, big tech and money. That is really the true army of the industrial military complex now, because that's the story that I laid out for you in the Danny Jones podcast, where they're using blue light, RF, microwaves, in many ways to control us through our dopamine reward tracks in our frontal lobes. That's the story that began with Dr. Kurt Plotner, with Meyer Lansky, with General Groves, with Sidney Gottlieb. And when you begin to see all these bows tied together, then you begin to understand why these two cats show up about a year ago before the election, named Casey and Callie Means. These two people are supposed food gurus, but they're linked to Susie Wiles, who now is named the chief of staff. And these food gurus are using the Hegelian dialect to try to focus on food and not technology as the cause. In fact, it gets really bad for the doctor, Casey Means. She went to Stanford Medical School. Remember I told you Stanford is linked to this whole thing. Who did she intern with before she went to medical school? Ann Wojcicki, the former ex-wife of Sergey Brin, who owns what? 23andMe. 23andMe is part of the targeting issue that works between wideband technology and this bioweapons program that will all be put together where offshore, because the Patriot Act does not allow us to do bioweapons research in the United States, which explains why Anthony Fauci was the highest paid person in the United States, because when he had to move Fort Detrick offshore, the industrial military complex players decided to pay him more than the president of the United States to basically take all the flack for that. And that's the reason why Fauci's been protected for as long as he's been protected. And Bobby has done a really good job of making that case in the book that he wrote about Fauci. The problem is you need to know the rest of this story that I'm giving you right now to see where all the pieces fit. It's kind of like the Tool song. I know how we fell apart because I know where the pieces fit, but you get this Casey and Callie Means to come in and try to convince the American populace, let's not give Trump too much shit about Operation Warp Speed, because he's the one that actually started this shitstorm. And I think that they wrongly felt that Trump's election would be harmed if he got linked to the vaccine story. And that's
if he had to talk about warp speed.
Absolutely. There's no question. And I think that's the reason why Casey and Callie Means, appeared like an asteroid that took out the dinosaurs. They show up on Rogan with no issues at all. And it just made no sense, because we have doctors that have been talking about food for literally 50 years. It goes back to Robert Atkins. It goes back to Lauren Cordain in the paleo community. And the thing that I think these two think we're dumbasses about, that you want to make Kellogg's and Fruit Loops, the enemy. People aren't dying from Fruit Loops and Kellogg's, okay? People are dying because your country and my country, we're mandated to take shots that had SV40 in it and have DNA plasmids in it. That's the real story. That's where people are dying at record rates the last 3 or 4 years, not Fruit Loops. And
forgive me, Jack. This has been, the first Danny Jones was the podcast that you keep referencing. If people haven't gone and listened to that, they really should. And the thing about it was, in today's world, podcast listeners listen to things on 1.5 speed, 2 speed, whatever speed they pick. And the way I'll get through the old airwaves to people is I had to listen to it on 1 speed, and I had to keep stopping it and going back and re-listening to parts, because I'm like, it happens. But very rarely does it happen where I get caught off guard over and over and over again. And you did that several times to where I'm like, got to go sit and listen to that. One of the things that sticks out to me is El Salvador. I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, so everybody stares at the United States and how it's it's the Rome that's falling down. It's on the cycle down, and it's falling apart. And can Trump save it? Can Trump not save it? On and on and on. This uniparty on and on. And I go, wait a second. What is it like? Where does Bukele stand on COVID, on the vaccines? Like, where does, because El Salvador seems like Bitcoin. You bring that up at the start of the story.
Uh-huh.
You talk about like I should have referenced when I was talking Tucker Carlson. I meant the Tucker Carlson interview with Bukele and how much it
Right.
stood out to me because I'm told these politicians do not exist. We can't exist like this. Then you go listen to Bukele and I'm like, oh my God, this guy exists. This place exists. They're arresting people. They're getting things done. They're attracting people. It seems like they're doing all the right things. I full story. I stare at El Salvador and I just go, this seems like it shouldn't exist on the planet, and yet there you are, and there it's sitting.
Yeah, well, it shouldn't, because guess what? The first thing that Bukele did, like I told you, he actually fixed the money. Now, in Bitcoin parlance, what we always say: if you fix the money, you fix the world. Well, Bukele fundamentally believes that. But let me tell you a little bit of background story that ties to what I just told you for the last hour and 20 minutes. So Bukele sees me tweeting. And, if you follow me on Twitter at all, you know that I have a pretty sharp tongue and my mouth's not a bakery and I go after everybody. And everybody else is getting canceled, but Jack's not. And Bukele sends his administration out and go, find out about this guy. Why is he able to say the things that he's doing and get away with it? So I get invited to a Palestra Society event, which basically is Bukele's political party brings people with good ideas down. You would probably consider it like TED Talks, but these are held in private. No one knows about them. You have to have a personal invitation. And the topic of my talk that time, this is now 2 years ago, was 20 things El Salvador needs to do to fix themselves and decentralize health. So I give this talk, and this is the funny part of the story. There was rules in place, Chatham rules, that we could not talk about any of these things publicly, and we're not allowed to film anything. And don't you think that the Bukele administration and the people that put this event on, because they moved my talk from the first day all the way to the last day. Why? Because during the meeting, I started calling out every person who had a new idea and basically saying this is bullshit, and I gave the people the reason why. And, I thought for the first 2 days, these people are going to hate my guts because I was going after them like a great white shark goes after a baby seal. And it turned out they loved it. Every time they said something, they'd hand me the mic, and I would give them my talk and my 2 cents on it. So the last day, I'm the last speaker, and I totally retool my talk, and I tell the guy that was putting it on, who works for the administration, I said, I want you to start the talk with a YouTube video of Depeche Mode, the policy of truth. I'm going to tell you exactly how we got where we got and why we need to do these 20 things. So I give them an abridged version of what I just gave you, the 120 or hour and 20 minutes we've been talking. And then I give them the 20 things that they can do. Well, it turns out the president's brother is sitting in the front row, and he's writing all this stuff down. And right after the talk, all these guys that I got finished ripping their heads off, they're up giving me a standing ovation for what I said. And I told them that we needed a constitutional amendment in the United States to stop the things that happen with the Titanic, with the USS Liberty, with 9/11, with JFK. And I told them that I envision some way down the road, this will eventually happen. So I get tapped on the shoulder and I talk to the president's brother for almost, I'm going to tell you, it was probably 3 hours that day and then 5 hours the next day. At the end of the 5 hours, he goes, I want you to be ready in 24 to 48 hours to go talk to my brother. I was like, okay. He goes, you're only going to get a half an hour. He goes, but you basically have to tell my brother in a half hour what you just told us in this 2-hour talk. I said, I got that. And I get tapped. They don't meet me publicly. I actually go to the president's house in his basement and basically tell him everything I told you. Then he casually tells me some of the things that happened to his country with the COVID jab. And he goes, the reason that we sought you out is because we followed everything that the WHO told us to do. Because, and he said to me, he goes, Jack, I'm not a doctor. He goes, I left it up to my health ministry. They told me this was the best advice, so I did it. He goes, within 2 months, we knew there was a problem. And he goes, and that's when I backed off. He goes, I started giving people little bags of all the shit you were talking about on Twitter. I started telling people, no, go outside. We're not going to lock you down. We didn't mandate foreigners to have injections to come in anymore because we realized that the policy was bad. So here you have a politician doing what Trudeau didn't do, what Biden didn't do, what nobody in Europe didn't do. But guess what? He didn't want to stick out like a sore thumb. So you never really heard about it, in the media where you are up at home. But he told me that's the reason they sought me out to come to El Salvador. He was stunned to find out I was already here. He didn't realize I was here because of Bitcoin. And so I wrote him the law. And the best part of the story is I wrote the law in one day and handed it to him. And I said, basically, this is the law that Benjamin Rush should have been allowed to put in the U.S. Constitution. And he told me, he goes, we have an election coming up. Once I get reelected, he goes, we're going to put this into our Congress and we're going to make this part of the law. So here's where the story gets really crazy. At the same time, I get a phone call from Nicole Shanahan, who becomes, Bobby's running mate. At this time, she's not in politics at all. She's the mother of Echo, a child with autism, who is the new wife of Sergey Brin. She just gets divorced from Brin over a lot of the stuff that we're talking about right now. And she says, I need your help. And I went nuclear on her, my friend. I mean, I was like, you and your ex-husband are the fucking reason why we have all these problems. I said, do you know that I have a member whose son is making a blue light blocking computer and that Sergey is blocking all of his opportunity to get money to make this computer to try to help people. It's like the anti-MK Ultra screen. And the guys that were behind were A16Z. Now, I didn't tell you this, but do you know who funded Casey Means' startup? A16Z. Starting to make sense to you now why I got a big problem with these people. So I tell Nicole, if you've truly changed, because remember, she's a patent attorney. She knows where all the bodies are buried in Google. She knows that I know about the RF, the microwaves, the search algorithms, how it's been weaponized, how it ties into 9/11 and everything else. And she's like, look, I'm out of that scene now. I only care about my daughter. And she offers me at that time $100 million to start a decentralized research facility here in El Salvador. And I tell her in classic Jack Kruse form, you can take your money and shove it up your ass because I don't trust you. I said, you want to do something with that money? I want you to save Anjan Kada's Daylight computer. So she does that. She actually funds him and keeps him going. So that's the first computer ever made in the world that doesn't have a blue lit screen that can harm you. Then the second thing she does, I point her to University of Texas at Austin. I said, there's a guy there named Francisco Gonzalez Lima, who is probably one of the guys that doesn't have his head up his ass. He does a lot of work on photobiomodulation, which is red light therapy, and diseases. I said, get him to do a study on red light and autism, because that's how the pathway needs to start. And I said, I'll make a deal with you. If you donate that money to those two causes, I'll write you a treatise on where I think Echo's autism really comes from. So she does. She invests the money, and I write a blog called Quantum Engineering 45 on Patreon about how melanopsin, blue light toxicity, ties to the autism epidemic. Ties to the story that I told you in the first hour and a half that we've been talking about. And she is stunned by this. She couldn't believe it. And things begin to happen. Nicole turns out, as you know, to be a big DNC person. She wants Bobby to run. She connects me with Bobby and says, look, I want you and Bobby to talk about vaccines on Rick's podcast. And she doesn't say it like that, but she says, do you have a podcast that you could do this that wouldn't be cancelable? I said, yeah, Rick's podcast, there's no way anybody's canceling Rick Rubin. So that's how the Bobby Kennedy thing comes together. And here's the crazy part of the story. I send Bobby the law. Like, I tell Bobby Kennedy's healthcare attorney, whose name is Aaron Siri, that I wrote this law for Bukele. Aaron says to me, can you send it to us? I said, I have to get clearance from the president first. So I asked Bukele, and Bukele said, yes, you can share it. So I send the law to Aaron and Bobby. Bobby calls me up and keeps me on the phone for probably an hour and a half at this time. Bobby tells me famously, he goes, if I gave this law to Ron DeSantis, remember, this is how early it is. DeSantis is still in the game before Trump. Because if I gave this law to Ron DeSantis, he couldn't even pass this in Florida. He goes, that's how encompassing this is. So Aaron calls me back, and they think that I want their help in formatting the law to get it passed in El Salvador. And I'm like, guys, hold my beer. Bukele's already going to get this passed. This is like, he's got 95% of his Congress. This is not an issue to get this constitutional amendment in. And then I get a call from Bobby about 4 to 6 weeks later. He goes, hey, do you think they would let us use 4 pages of the law for our platform? Then magically, this is when you start hearing about MAHA. This is when you start hearing about mitochondrial medicine. This is when you start hearing all the things that, he's become famous for the last year and a half. They come from this collaboration that we have. And I've told him from the beginning, I said, look, my bottom line is I want to see the world a better place. If you want to know why I got into this business, why I picked up the challenge with Becker, is because I think this guy was done wrong, by being canceled because of the industrial military complex. And when I went to meet with him in 2007 before he died, he told me when he got canceled in 77 after going on 60 Minutes that he had 30 years to get rid of his bitter pill in his stomach about this. So he started sharing ideas on these industrial military players. So guess how Jack got a lot of these connections made? Through that meeting with Becker that I had in 2007. And then magically, 6 months later, I get a call from Nicole that she gets tapped to be the vice president for Bobby. And I'm sitting there going, I think my life just got a little bit interesting. And then I started to realize that this was going to be the time that I had to go from apolitical to political, because this got dropped in my lap. And really, this was a story about Becker. This was a story about the industrial military complex, about all the different things that they have done to try to steal science and steal the American form of government away. And I had to make a decision. And, if you go back and listen to the Rick Rubin podcast, the one I did with Huberman, the first one, Rick tells everybody on the podcast, he goes, yeah, Jack didn't answer me for 6 weeks when I asked him to do this. Now you probably understand the reason why. Is because I knew who Huberman was, and I knew his links to SRI. I knew who was funding him. I know why his podcast is famous. It's because all the people, the nefarious people I told you about through DARPA and the industrial military complex, are behind him. The architects of COVID, the architects of the Patriot Act. Those are the people that are behind him. And that's the reason why it gave me pause. And my nurse, Chantel, who you communicated with, she's the one that said, I think this is the time, Jack. I think this is the time that you need to kind of go out and tell everybody the story. And I was like, I don't know if this is it. I think what I can do is I can go out and tell them the science part of this, which is POMC, which is the parts that Becker missed, but it's also the parts that MK Ultra, the SRI people, and the brain health people weaponized. So that's what I did. And then it's more through every podcast since then, where I gave you a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And
well, here, Jack, I gotta I'm pretty sure our time comes up at the top of the hour, so I want to be really cognizant of that. I would go. What I'm like is, what I want to do is I just want to have you back on, because I want to go back and re-listen to this. I know the audience is going to listen to it, and then there's going to be 5-10 more questions come. And what I'm realizing from you is, if I point you in the right direction, I'm going to get deeper down any which hole we want to choose to dig on for that day. Assuming you're like, yeah, that'd be okay. I guess, I appreciate you coming on. I want to make sure that I get you out of here on time. And I want to just ask for more time on a different day, if that's agreeable to you.
It just depends on my schedule. Like I said, you connect with Chantel, and she's the one that controls my life.
Fair enough. Well, if Chantel's listening, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I appreciate you hopping on today and doing this, and hopefully we'll get another chat in the future.
All right, sounds good.